are gonna move on to our second speaker, Mr. Adam Friedlander. He's a food policy analyst from FDA, and he is gonna, thank you so much, Dr. Prader. He is gonna talk about the new traceability rule. He's gonna give us some overview of the rule. We know that the industry doesn't need to comply with the rule until 2026, but I think this is a good time for all of us to learn more about the rule and get ready.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Farzad, for the invitation. And I just wanted to thank you all for being here today. And I'm wondering, can you all see my screen?
We can see your screen, but it's not on this is great. Thank you.
Great. Well, so I really just want to start by thanking Dr. Prader for his excellent presentation. He gave so many great insights. And I just want to, before I provide my affiliation, just provide some very brief themes that I took away from his presentation. So Don mentioned the common language of food traceability being established by this final rule. And it really lays the foundation for end-to-end supply chain visibility. And this rule, by creating that common language, really creates that, next steps for the industry to innovate on top of this final rule. So with this new final rule, we believe that we can improve outbreak investigations. We can, limit the scope of recalls or even broaden the scope of recalls with that better data that we're seeing. And really, and one of the final points that I wrote down is that with this new rule, we'll be able to have more accurate information within our supply chain. But that means that we're going to be able to have faster retrieval of that information too, especially as we move away from predominantly paper-based record-keeping system and move toward more digital tracing. So I'm very excited to be here and talk about FDA's new food traceability final rule, which was just published in November of 2022, so just a few months ago. So this is a brand new regulation, and I'm excited to provide a little information about it. So my name is Adam Friedlander. I'm a food scientist by training, and I have a master's in regulatory affairs of food as well. So working in the Coordinated Outbreak Response and Evaluation Network here at FDA really combines all of my passions in food safety, in technology, and outbreak response. And one thing that I think is very interesting from the previous presentation is each of the core elements that Don talked about, there is true intersection with each of them. So with tech-enabled traceability, how do we use traceability to leverage the power of whole genome sequencing, artificial intelligence, predictive analytics? Tech-enabled traceability is certainly going to have an impact on retail modernization, whether it's e-commerce or these brick and mortar retail locations, and also food safety culture. What role does food traceability play with food safety culture? And what does it look like in the coming decade or decades on how food traceability is going to impact the overall food system? So really, I hope today to sort of provide some initial thoughts on what does the future of food traceability look like because of this final rule, and how do we inspire and educate the next generation of food industry, food system professionals that are going to elevate the role of food traceability and ultimately protect public health and make our food supply chain more safe and more resilient. So just diving into the rule, as Dr. Farzad mentioned, January 20th, 2026 is the compliance date. And during the proposed rulemaking period, we received many comments saying that a 2-year compliance date was too soon, and we agreed. So that is why we extended it to 3 years for the covered entities to you know, come up to speed on what the rule entails and working with their supply chain partners to become compliant with the rule. So this rule is at the heart of this rule is additional record keeping beyond those that are outlined in the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. So the records require persons who manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods on the food traceability list to maintain what we call key data elements at specific critical tracking events. And I'll go a little more into detail on that in just a few minutes, but this covers the entire food supply chain. So from farm, both produce and seafood, all the way to retail food establishments. This rule includes both foreign and domestic entities. So whether you're a foreign supplier that is exporting into the United States, this rule covers those entities as well. And I'll speak a little more about the full and partial exemptions, but I also just wanted to note that we do have many resources that we are going to cover in this rule, and we encourage everyone to submit questions to us if there are any very technical, nuanced responses. So we really wanted to take the approach of educating before and while we regulate. We recognize that this rule may be very new to many people, and we're starting to think about how our compliance strategy. But really, at the heart of this is we're trying to improve outbreak response here at FDA. And I can tell you from CORE's perspective, when we conduct foodborne outbreak investigations, we're working with the CDC, USDA, state, local, tribal, territorial, and even international government counterparts to conduct these outbreak investigations. And it really relies on access to good data, as Don mentioned. So whether it's the supply chain records, those purchase orders, those bills of lading, but it also relies on consumer data as well. So when CDC or any state regulator talks to consumers who are sickened by food, they ask, well, what did you eat? And if we're able to have better insight into the foods, specific foods, what food, where did I purchase from, what is the information behind that food, we can combine that data from the consumer with this supply chain data. So this is really what I'm talking about when we're saying we're laying the foundation for end-to-end supply chain visibility. So this compliance date is going to come up quick. I just wanted to note that planning for this compliance date should begin now. I encourage everyone to read the rule, to check out all of our resources, and also work with your supply chain partners to begin to understand how is this rule going to impact me? How is it going to impact my partners in the supply chain? And am I able to collect all of this data? So very briefly, I just wanted to highlight that this rule applies only to the foods that are on the food traceability list. So there's a list of foods, as you see on the screen, of the foods. So whether it's cheeses, shell eggs, nut butters, cucumbers, herbs, leafy greens, melons, peppers, sprouts, tomatoes. And you'll see that those are in their fresh or fresh cut varieties. So if they're frozen, frozen cucumbers or frozen herbs or dried herbs, dried peppers, they are not on the food traceability list, and thus they do not need to maintain those additional records required by the rule. But you'll notice right here that you'll see certain species of seafood that are both fresh and frozen. So if that's the case, then whether it's fresh or frozen seafood, if the crustaceans, if you're manufacturing processing, packing, holding food on this food traceability, you do need to maintain the records unless you're covered by that exemption. So I just wanted to briefly highlight that that's the scope of this rule. So I talked a little bit about, at the heart of this rule, what are the key concepts? So it's those critical tracking events and those key data elements. And I already talked about that this rule is truly the first step in creating a standard language of food traceability that I believe is going to, be impactful for decades to come. And there is opportunity for us to, look outside of just the United States with this common language of food traceability. So looking at international standards or international governments that are going to adopt potentially these core data elements that are outlined by the rule. But I think it's very, very important just early on in this presentation to state that this rule provides the what and the where, meaning what information do I need to collect and where do I collect that information? This rule does not provide the how of traceability. The industry is responsible for working together and coming up with a how. So there are many ways to, send documents or records across your supply chains. There's, EDI messages, there's EPCIS. You can continue to use paper records. So we're not dictating at all how a company chooses to utilize traceability technology. We're technology agnostic. We don't endorse any specific technology. What we're most concerned about is the data itself. And I think one of the most groundbreaking components of this rule is that we're now defining the concept of a traceability lot code. And the firm, and I'll go into this a little in more detail in just a few moments, but there is flexibility on how a lot code is assigned, but there are very strict limitations on who can assign that traceability lot code. And I'll provide examples of, what we're looking for when you see the bullet here, provide records to FDA within 24 hours. But at the tail end of this sentence should be records provided to FDA within 24 hours in an electronic sortable spreadsheet. And I'll go into what an electronic sortable spreadsheet is and, an example of what it looks like. And we believe that with this rule, we're actually going to have faster product identification and the removal of contaminated products from the market. And this is because of this traceability lot code. We believe that when traceability lot codes are assigned at particular points in the supply chain, that we as outbreak investigators will be able to, by over 80%, be able to go back to the source of where that lot code was assigned. And that is critical during these, very large scale or even small scale foodborne outbreaks that truly cause harm to consumers. So this is why this rule is so important and why I'm so excited to share more information. So in this rule, there is an emphasis on keeping and sharing the KDEs associated. So I'll provide examples of, you receive information, you ship information, and when you ship information, that shipping information should correspond directly to the next in line's receiving record. So there is continuity along the supply chain, and the traceability lot code is the glue that holds that link together. You see the traceability lot code source, the TLC source, and this is a component within a firm's record keeping based on this rule, where we can pinpoint who assigned this traceability lot code. And all of this information needs to be outlined within a firm's traceability plan. And these are just, the policies and the procedures of how you're maintaining your traceability records, how you're assigning a traceability lot code, in some instances providing geographic information as well. And finally, this rule requires, it is so critically essential that firms need to work with their supply chain partners in order to be able to receive the correct information and then send that information to the next in line. So we're just wanted to highlight that. And I wanted to provide a brief example of what we've seen at FDA of records that are mostly paper-based. They're not standardized in a way where FDA can easily understand where the food is flowing throughout the supply chain. So you see purchase orders, you see bills of lading, you see advanced shipment notices, and that's totally acceptable to continue having paper records that are already established in a business practice. But what we're looking for in this rule is a spreadsheet that organizes all of that information easily, so that way when FDA is asking for information, that firm will easily be able to provide it to us. So you'll see here, this is a tomato purchase order, and there is a lot of information here. Some of it is typed, some of it is handwritten, and this is, it can be very difficult to sift through many paper records in order to figure out who shipped this product to this entity in the supply chain, and based on this information, where did it go next? So I just wanted to briefly highlight what we've seen at FDA, and this graphic also demonstrates how complex supply chains can be. And this is a traceback diagram that we created based off of the 2018 romaine lettuce outbreaks that led to widespread market withdrawals of romaine lettuce from store shelves, and also many people got sick. So as you can see, based on certain points of sale, there are many steps along the supply chain, many arrows, and if I'm a grower or harvester, then I have certain ranches, and then from these ranches, there are just so many different options of where did this romaine lettuce come from. So this really highlights the fact that supply chains are complex, and that with this rule, we think that we'll be able to more rapidly and accurately go back from point of service all the way to the specific farm from where that food came from. So I just very briefly want to highlight some of the exemptions in the rule. They're very important, and I'll provide some more practical information that highlights some of these exemptions, but at a very, very high level, I just want to highlight first, the owner, operator, or agent in charge of a fishing vessel is exempt from the rule. And this is a partial exemption where if you're required to register as a food facility, then you must maintain the records of the immediate previous source and the immediate subsequent recipient. And this is, standard based on the Bioterrorism Act's one up, one back approach to food traceability. If you're not required to register as a food facility, then this is a total exemption. And I'll highlight that in just a few moments. Similarly, if you manufacture, process, pack, or hold food that was obtained from a fishing vessel, and that food has not yet been sold by the owner, operator, or agent in charge of the fishing vessel, then you are also exempt from the rule. And once again, this is a partial exemption. So if you are required to register, you do have to keep those one up, one back records. Another thing to be aware of is that the final rule does not apply to raw bivalve mollusk and shellfish that are covered by the requirements of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program or subject to the provisions here listed on the slide are for imported mollusk and shellfish. So if any one of those three things is going on, the raw bivalve mollusk and shellfish is exempt from the rule. But as you saw on the food traceability list, certain mollusk and shellfish are covered by the rule. Next, I want to talk about a kill step. So kill step meaning the lethality processing that significantly minimizes pathogens to a food on the food traceability list. That requirement would not apply. These additional records would not apply to foods that undergo a kill step. So if you have documentation that you did have a kill step for, this specific species of fish or seafood, then you do not need to continue maintaining the food traceability rules records. There are also exemptions in here about written agreements. So if you know that this food is going to undergo a kill step, you can enter into written agreements with your supply chain partners stating specifically that this food will undergo a kill step and thus I do not need to maintain records. If a food is changed to a form so that it is no longer on the list, then there is an exemption for that. So previously I was talking about, frozen leafy greens would not be covered under the list, but frozen seafood is. However, if fresh or frozen seafood is transformed into dried seafood is not on the food traceability list, and thus the records that are required under the rule are no longer required. And then I'll also touch upon commingling seafood from different farms or different landing vessels after vessels have landed. So this does not apply to produce raw agricultural commodities. This is really intended for seafood and eggs. So if this is the case, if you're receiving commingled seafoods before processing, then there is an exemption. But again, you need to maintain one up, one back records if you're a registered food facility, but if you're not, then these records would not apply. And lastly, the electronic sortable spreadsheet, there is an exemption if you're a certain size or you make a certain monetary value, then the electronic sortable spreadsheet would not be required. However, even if FDA calls, by phone, certain information would need to be provided to FDA. They just don't need to use the electronic sortable spreadsheet. But again, all of these are exemptions. And for the most part, the rule would apply. But if you do have any questions, I'll highlight some of the tools that we have and the resources available to figure out if you would apply for an exemption. So I want to talk about the first land-based receiver of a food obtained from a fishing vessel. This is such a critical component of the rule for the seafood industry. And I think this is an area where there's going to be a lot of work surrounding the documentation. And so the first land-based receiver is the person taking possession of a food for the first time on land directly from a fishing vessel. So it's important, this land-based receiver is important because it is required to assign that traceability lot code. So under the rule, there are 3 instances when a traceability lot code can be assigned. That is that first land-based receiver of a food obtained from a fishing vessel. It is the initial packer of a raw agricultural commodity, like produce, and then transformation. So if I'm transforming the product from one form to another, and that transformation still, has food on the food traceability list and that new transformed product, those are the only times when a traceability lot code can be assigned. So I'm going to provide some example supply chain scenarios that shows you where the traceability lot code flows throughout the supply chain. So on the slide, you'll see that the fishing vessel is exempt from the rule. However, once the first land-based receiver obtains the food, they need to maintain those first land-based receiving KDEs, those key data elements, And you'll notice that each of these are the critical tracking events, and underneath the critical tracking events are where the key data elements are collected and maintained. So in this specific scenario, you have the receiving KDEs. Maybe this first land-based receiver is also a processor and they transform the product. So they would be able to take those that initial traceability lot code, and they need to now assign a new traceability lot code. But this new traceability lot code would be able to link back to that input of that initial traceability lot code. And then when the transformation is complete, then that first land-based receiver is going to ship their data to the importer or the wholesaler. And that importer wholesaler will maintain receiving records, and these receiving records correspond directly to the shipping records. And then once the wholesaler ships the product to the distributor, you know, they're also going to need to maintain shipping records. Then the distributor then needs to maintain receiving KDEs and the shipping KDEs. And ultimately the food is going to go to the receiver at the retail food establishment. So as you can see, all of the information should theoretically be able to link together, and what's holding them together is that traceability lot code. And this is a very similar scenario as well. The previous slide, yes, was whole tuna, and this is frozen tuna loins. And as you can see, it's the same scenario. I've been to a seafood facility where, you know, I'm a wholesaler, I'm a distributor, but I also have a processing component to an operation. So I'm receiving the traceability lot code, but I'm also transforming the product and then shipping it to a food retail establishment. So these are very specific scenarios, but the point here is that the lot code needs to be maintained if that assigned lot code is received and shipped throughout the supply chain, unless you're transforming the product or if you're that initial packer. I want to provide another brief example. I touched upon this in the exemption slide, but if I'm a fishing vessel, I'm exempt. But if I also own that seafood processing step before that first land-based receiving, then that entity that's owned by the fishing vessel is also exempt from the rule. So when the seafood processor sends food to the importer or wholesaler, that importer wholesaler would then be considered that first land-based receiver. And they need to assign that traceability lot code. So they have receiving key data elements, they're going to assign that traceability lot code, they're going to ship the product to the distributor, and that traceability lot code will be maintained throughout the supply chain. And I understand it's very theoretical to talk about key data elements and critical tracking events, but what information do I need to collect and maintain? So here I just provided some brief bullet points of what we're looking for in terms of key data elements. So it's that traceability lot code that you assigned, how much food you obtained, what you obtained, so like a product description, the location and date range of the trip during which it was caught, the date you obtained it, and that traceability lot code source information, i.e. that first land-based receiver, the entity that transformed the food. That column is really for FDA to say, this is the entity that assigned that traceability lot code. And then finally, that reference document information as well. So that's going to be your, you know, purchase order 11113, for example, or bill of lading X. That's going to provide FDA, when we're conducting an outbreak investigation, to look at the actual record itself. And then once that receiving key data elements are all their, that information will then be used for shipping KDEs. So these shipping KDEs will then be sent over to the next in line and the next in line. So I talked a little bit about an electronic sortable spreadsheet. So upon request by FDA, firms must provide an electronic sortable spreadsheet containing the information that we're looking for within the rule. And we're going to ask for this information when necessary to prevent or mitigate a foodborne illness outbreak. It could be used to assist in a recall or otherwise address a threat to public health. These records must be provided to FDA within 24 hours or within a reasonable time to which FDA has agreed. This electronic sortable spreadsheet will assist FDA in analyzing traceability information quickly. So in terms of record maintenance and availability, the records need to be legible, original paper, electronic, or true copies. So this is going back to, we're not dictating how a company needs to maintain their records. We're looking for electronic sortable spreadsheets in an organized way, but firms can continue to use whatever system of records they're currently using. These records may include electronic links as well. The records must be kept for 2 years. And I spoke previously, but they need to be made available to FDA within 24 hours. They can be stored off-site or by another entity, so long as those records can be made available to FDA within 24 hours. And I spoke also about a phone request of records, or email or other communications where FDA is asking for these records. So this is an example of an electronic sortable spreadsheet. This is simply a template. It's an example. It is not the only way to provide an electronic sortable spreadsheet to FDA. We're currently in the process of developing a product tracing system that can input data, traceability data from the industry based on the requirements outlined in the rule, but we're going to create the system so it can accept all data formats, file types, Excel files, PDFs, JPEGs, XML files, and even email records as well. So here you'll see that we have the traceability lot code. We have the quantity and unit of measure, a product description, that immediate previous source location description, the receiving location, the receiving date, the traceability lot code source description and or reference, and that reference document type and number. And I just want to briefly mention that this TLC source, and Dr. Prater mentioned this, there is commercial confidential information within the supply chain. And we wanted to be sensitive to the fact that people in the supply chain don't always want to share sensitive information with their supply chain partners. So that sensitive information, if you're a co-packer, for example, and you don't want people to know that you're using a specific co-packer, this column here provides that, if you know that FDA unique facility registration number, if you know a specific address, or if you want to use some sort of digital link, like right here, there's a GS1 digital link example. And if you click that link, FDA and FDA only will be able to access that information of who assigned that traceability lot code. So this is really a creative way for FDA to understand who assigned that traceability lot code while maintaining confidentiality throughout the supply chain. And then finally, I just wanted to briefly highlight some of the resources that FDA has available on the FDA's website. So the first place that I would start, and Dr. Farzad, I'll share these slides with you, and everyone can have access to them. They include working links, so feel free to click on them and learn more about this food traceability rule. But this is the landing page. This is where you're going to explore the information within it. And then we have our resources, our tools, the actual Federal Register notice itself. We have FAQs, and we also have a place where you can contact us with more information. So I'll share all of these with you as well. This is the exemptions tool that I was speaking about previously. So it's an interactive tool where if you click on this link, you can see if you would apply for an exemption. So, if I'm saying, oh, fishing vessels, Muscat shellfish, click on that, and it'll just take you through the process of figuring out if you do have an exemption or if you are covered under the rule. This is the key data element and critical tracking event tool that's on FDA's website. It's also interactive, and you can go critical tracking event by critical tracking event and figure out what key data elements need to be maintained under each of these critical tracking events. And it also provides information about what exact information do I need to maintain under my traceability plan. This is the traceability rule FAQ page. So we receive many, many questions, and we work continuing to update our FAQ page based on the questions that we've received. So you'll see many different types of questions, whether it's a first land-based receiver or retail food establishments, commingled raw agricultural commodities, a kill step, and we provide detailed responses to them. And this is the Federal Register notice, and this is really the rule. So in the preamble to the Federal Register notice, we respond to comments that we received during the proposed rulemaking period. And this is really where you're going to find those nuanced responses to FDA's thinking about the rule, why we went with certain foods on the food traceability list, why we went with certain exemptions, the thoughts behind the traceability lot code and lot code source reference. And at the very end of the rule are these regulatory requirements. So what records must I keep when I receive a food on the food traceability, when I transform a food? And if you just go down the list here, you'll see exactly what's needed. And we tried in our communications materials on the landing page to sort of distill this, but at the heart, this is the rule. And I also just wanted to note that Congress had always intended for FDA to have this food traceability final rule. It was actually written into the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, Section 204. So Congress passed the law, and FDA had to undergo rulemaking to make this rule final. And we're really excited because we think that this rule aligns with industry best practices, and it also sets the stage for industry to innovate on top of this rule. So we're here to answer any questions that you all may have, and we have a FSMA Technical Assistance Network, and we highly encourage anyone to reach out to us and submit a question if you're confused about the rule, if you want any clarifications. You'll see for assistance with human food topics, submit your question to the TAN. Feel free to ask any questions, and we just ask that you be as specific as possible, so that way we can answer your questions to the best of our ability. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you have. Feel free to reach out anytime, and again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that great presentation. I learned a lot myself. So I'm going to start reading the question in the chat. Let me see. I don't know what's going on with my Zoom here. Okay. So I think we had a question at the beginning before you started your presentation from Andrew Rose. Let me see if I can find a question in the chat. Okay. So Adam Rose has Adam, if an entrepreneur wants to solve a hard problem in food traceability, which sector or area would you suggest they look at?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. So it really depends on what part of the supply chain you're in. There are resources available, so I would recommend reaching out to trade associations, professional organizations, academic institutions that are looking at traceability have many great resources out there. But if you're, specific to the retail sector, then understanding the processes behind collecting data from your distribution center or from a processing facility themselves. So that's the first place that I would start. But really looking at the rule first is going to be the first place that you should look to familiarize yourself with the requirements under the rule. And then, there are so many software solutions out there that are focused on traceability, but it's very important to, vet these solution providers and understand that they're aligned with what we're asking for under the traceability rule. And we also recognize that, these traceability food safety use cases are just the floor. There are many more use cases for why traceability is important, such as sustainability, food waste, food fraud, food defense, overall business intelligence. So I would just research as much as you can about food traceability, talk with solution providers, talk with academic institutions, talk to us at FDA. Dr. Prater mentioned the low-no challenge, and that was truly a snapshot in time, and that did not make up a totality of food traceability solutions out there, but we think it's a good place to start to familiarize yourself with key concepts. So I hope that helped, Andrew.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat that Scott Zimmerman is asking. I see some products like frozen spinach and berries that have been associated with class 1 recalls were not included on the final rule. So why is the reason for that?
Yeah, that's another great question. I appreciate you asking it. So FDA was mandated under the Food Safety Modernization Act to come up with a risk ranking model, and Congress outlined the exact inputs that would create this risk ranking model for food tracing. And in the analysis, it looked at historical outbreaks and overall risk factors, and frozen spinach, frozen berries, frozen produce did not score highly enough, so it was not included on the food traceability list. However, it is very important to note that we are going to update the food traceability list every 5 years. So just because it's not on the list now doesn't mean that it's not going to be in the future. And the truth is we've heard from, exempted portions of the food industry that they're, not even going to pay attention to the exemptions. They're going to just follow the key data elements and critical tracking event record keeping requirements that are outlined in the rule, even if they're not covered under the rule. And we're definitely not forcing them to do it. They're doing it voluntarily, but it just shows the complexity of having numerous systems of record keeping. And we think that, they certainly have the right to develop their own record keeping system, but it seems like that's where the industry is moving, is toward uniformity voluntarily.
Thank you. Do we have any other question in the room?
Just asking about the transformation to be able to assign the traceability law. If it becomes a transformation as defined by customs, or it's just transformation like could be just repacking?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I heard correctly, the question was, is it transformation through customs, or is it transformation through something like co-packing or repacking of product, or even taking, a a whole tuna and breaking it down into different tuna parts. Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So the customs question, I do not believe that would be a transformation event. This is really that repacking, breaking it down into different parts of the fish, and then if you're selling a whole tuna and you're doing nothing to it, but you're still that first land-based receiver. So if you send a whole tuna throughout the supply chain and there's no processing involved whatsoever, that traceability lot code is going to remain the same. However, if you're taking that whole tuna and you're doing custom orders to different grocery stores, and you're breaking it down into numerous parts, maybe dozens of fresh or frozen varieties of that singular whole tuna, that's a transformation event. So when the grocery store receives that food, they'll know that traceability lot code. And when FDA is conducting an outbreak investigation, we'll be able to link that traceability lot code to that processing step. And once we go to the processing step, we'll be able to go back to that first land-based receiver based on the information that we gather from that, the person who transformed the food.
Thank you, Adam. Do you have any other questions in the room? I have some question myself, so I was waiting for other people. So you kind of answered one of my questions. Do you think eventually many other food are gonna get added to the list? I think the answer is yes. You mentioned something about traceability plan. So is this something, because we teach lots of HACCP to the seafood industry, that they need to have a separate traceability plan, or it can be a component of their HACCP plan, or they have flexibility to do whatever they want? Yeah,
that's a great question. So we're not going to dictate how they want to organize their traceability plan, just that the requirements under the traceability plan are there. So if they want to put it in their HACCP plan documentation, that's totally fine. If they want to have a separate 1 to 2 page document that's separate from that, that's also totally fine, just as long as we know that information.
Also something relevant to that, because the seafood industry, because I work closely with seafood industry, they already keep all of those records, all of those information that you showed me. So the FDA with this rule is just like making sure that everyone is consistent and harmonizing the industry and put a specific name on those records.
Exactly.
Okay.
That is exactly correct. So we believe that most of this information is already existing out there in the industry, whether it's the seafood, the produce, the soft cheese industry, the nut butter industry. This information is there. So we're not mandating any way to put a label on a package. That's not what this rule is about. This rule is about the information that is contained within, if you're using a barcode, for example, are you able to determine the product description, the quantity unit of measure? Now this traceability lot code, are you able to tell us who shipped you that product, and are you able to tell us where that product is going? So that's really the essence of the rule. And when I've been to seafood facilities, I've seen, highly skilled workers who are in very wet environments, who are not only processing the food, but they also have to be in charge of maintaining paper records, and they're using pen and paper in a wet room. And so with this rule, if you're transforming the product, you have to come up with a new traceability lot code. And when you're doing that in a wet room, how do you digitize that? How can you begin to think about the steps to take that information and be able to, organize it in an electronic sortable spreadsheet, so that way when FDA is asking for it, you'll be able to provide it. And certainly that's difficult, and that's why we provided more time for the compliance date. But this is really a huge opportunity for the seafood sector to come together and figure out an approach to best capture those transformation events.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have any other question on the Zoom? I don't see anything in the chat. What about the room? No question in the room. Thank you so much, Adam. This was great.
Well,
yes,
thank you so much.
Glad that you could make it.
I appreciated all the questions, and I'll share the PowerPoint presentation with you as well. So thanks again, everyone.
That is great. Okay, so we are going to move on to our first break. And I just wanted to mention that my colleague, Dr. Praga, is sending all of those links to the chat while our speakers are talking. In 15 minutes, we are